Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this first webinar in the International Hour webinar series. It's great to have you all here with us today. My name is Daniela Karl. I'm the Deputy CEO at the Regional Studies Association. The International Hour is organized by the RSA's International Community and Network. The series presents insights into regional and urban research, developments and policies from around the world, and offers also a platform for discussion and the exchange of ideas. In case you have a topic we should cover as an International Hour, please get in touch. The Regional Studies Association, in case you're new to us, is a global international interdisciplinary network for regional and urban research, development and policy. The RSA supports its members and the community with latest research, funding schemes, networking, publishing, and training opportunities and spaces to grow research and careers. In 2021, we run and hosted a number of online events. For example, we continue with our well-established monthly webinar series, the Professional Development webinar series, and also the Regions, Cities and Industry webinar series. These are free to attend and open to all, but require registration. Members can access recordings on demand in the RSA Lounge. In 2021, we hosted our first global e-festival, which was called Regions in Recovery. This was our biggest event yet. Another session or program we run in 2021 is Right Here, Right Now, which is something we started last year. That's an online writing session, and I believe there are still some spaces available, but in any case, there's a waiting list which you can join in case this is of interest. Forthcoming highlight for this year is the annual lecture series, which will be in November. These sessions will highlight timely topics relevant to the journals and the community. More information on all our events and how to sign up can be found on the website. Today's International Hour will focus on Switzerland, and I would like to thank our local partners, ROREP, the Schweizerische Studiengesellschaft für Raumordnung und Regionalpolitik, and the RSA's Ambassador to Switzerland, Uri-Switzerland, for working with us on the session. Thanks also to the speakers and the chair for their time and contribution. I'm really looking forward to the session today. Looking ahead in the series, the next session after this will be on the 13th of October and focus on the impact of COVID on the lives and livelihood of slum dwellers in India. After India, we move on to Poland in November. On the 18th of November, we will have a session on the role of EU funds in Polish regional and local development. In December then, we will be in Mexico and hear about cross-border production systems. More details on this session will follow shortly for the website. So without further ado, I wish you all an enjoyable session and shall hand over to Uge. Thank you.
So very welcome from my side. It's a big pleasure to be here with you, with the RSA European and international community, and at the same time here with the Swiss community on spatial planning and regional policy. We have been here in Andermat since yesterday. This is a small conference bringing together the community in Switzerland, the research community and the praxis community, dealing with spatial planning on every topics in Switzerland, but especially about the future of the regional policy, Swiss regional policy, what we are going to deal with in a couple of minutes with my colleagues. So I'm very pleased as a RSA ambassador to Switzerland to organize this first webinar, International Hour. It's also a big honor for the ROREP and regiosuisse who are organizing this session to be the first, pioneering this international session. So I won't go further into the details. Daniela already showed the program, but I will leave the floor now to Daniel Baumgartner, who is the first organizer of this session and the first discussant, who will then introduce our keynote speaker. I wish you all a very pleasant presentation.
Okay, also from my side, a very warm welcome to the community online and to our little tiny community, but highly specialized community here in Andermat in the Swiss Alps. So when I just to introduce you the place, which I have the honor to chair the session here. This is Andermat. We're in a gymnastic hall. And really are looking forward for an interesting discussion which is coming up, so we hope. What is our agenda today? Our agenda today is, of course, to have the welcome from the RSA that we already had. Then Hugues introduced the ROREP and the purpose of this little webinar. And as a next topic, I'm going to make a short introduction on regions and transition in Switzerland. After this short introduction, we have a keynote, an expert on transition studies, Christian Binz from EAWAG. He's going to dive into the topic on transition and particularly the roles of regions in the transition that we as a society, as economy, have before us. After the keynote from Christian, we are open to this for a discussion. My colleague Tina Haisch will moderate this discussion. Let me come to the short introduction. Regions and transition in Switzerland, and I will talk from a policy perspective on this role of regions as engines for transition. For us as ROREP, it is important to have a dialogue between policy and science. And the international hour that we have now is for us a kind of kickoff, a kind of starting event that should stimulate the discussion on the role of regions in the upcoming transition discussions, transition to a sustainable development, to sustainable regional development. So it is a great opportunity to have the international community on board. And we really like to have an intense discussion from the science side, which we can take with us for our transition series that we as a ROREP are intended to start in Switzerland on the topic of regions and their role in transition to a more sustainable development. Just to give you the impression on what's the policy issue with transition to a sustainable development. So from a policy perspective, we're in a rat race, basically. You have daily businesses to do, you have stakeholders to deal with, you have to develop laws, discuss policy things, and basically you're in a rat race on daily issues and status quo. On the other hand of the slide, you see we have, for the first time in history, we have global sustainable development goals. So actually, we as policymakers, we actually know what sustainable development what sustainable development means, how it is measured, how it is operationalized at the global level. So the first time in history that we have this long-term normative perspective to see in which direction our policies should be developed. But you see also on this slide, and this is really the reality for policymakers, the distance between the actual rat race and the long-term sustainable development goals. This transition process, this is really a huge challenge that we all face, and this is not only the case in Switzerland. I think this is the case in all developed countries. I give you a short introduction how Switzerland, and I think many other countries too, tackles this challenge. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. We are happy to have these. And then the federal administration took this goal, worked on a report, worked on a strategy, which finally came out this year, this spring. It came out a Swiss national sustainable development strategy. And what then happens? The regions, some cantons, developed their own strategies. The administration wrote down these strategies into paper, and basically now we are waiting how this strategy will come up and will come in touch with the citizen, and will be developed from bottom up in concrete in activities. So we had a classical top-down approach to tackle the challenge of transition to these sustainable development goals. Now, Switzerland is a particular case. So we're kind of a laboratory. We had this summer a popular vote on one of the essential sustainability goals. It's climate action. So we had the carbon dioxide law, which we had to decide if we want to go in a direction to decarbonize economy and society. And the popular clearly say, no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to go in this direction. We are not ready for this transition process, which is, of course, from a sustainable development perspective, absolutely needed. And this is kind of frustrating. On the other hand, it demonstrates the reality of many countries, but Switzerland is a particular case where we see it actually. Popular votes say clearly, no, we are not ready to go in this direction what concerns climate action. And this is a struggle. And what we want to discuss with the community in Switzerland, it's to focus on the regional level and to discuss the issue. Are regional and local initiatives, are these the way forward? I have here, this is a copy from a OECD report, and you see that there is activities at regional and local level on some of the SDGs. It's about environment, green infrastructure, it's about renewable energies, soft and clean mobility, consumption, food waste, and so on. These are SDGs which are tackled at the regional and local level. And the great question for us from a federal perspective is, how can we activate these regional initiatives, these regional and local initiatives, scale it up, and motivate the population to come onto the journey to transition into the direction of a more sustainable development. So that's the basic question we want to discuss in this session. Are these local and regional initiatives the way forward for the transition in the direction of for sustainable regional development, sustainable development in general? That's the basic question, and I'm really happy to have here an expert in transition studies, to have Christian among us. And Christian had prepared a presentation which is gonna exactly give us the answer to these challenging questions, and he will present us some insights from transition studies. And then we're really looking forward to an inspiring keynote, and I hand over the floor to Christian.
So thanks a lot, Daniel, and yeah, thanks a lot to the organizers for having me here. This is a really interesting sort of hybrid event, which I really look forward to a lot. And I'm going to have to make a spoiler alert that I cannot solve all these problems, but I committed to give some reflections at least, you know, what transition studies could bring to the policy tables, to discussions about sustainable regional development. So just to set the stage at the beginning, I think we've seen this in sort of the event here in the prior days, you know, when thinking about transformation to sustainability, what is at hand is really a daunting challenge, because essentially what we have to do is to create the third social metabolic revolution in human history. So we have had two of them before. One was when we passed from hunters and gatherers to sort of pastoral societies. Then the second one from pastoral to industrial society. And now we have 30 years to move to a sort of sustainable civilization that looks completely different from what we have now. And this implies huge changes for lifestyles. So there's literature on planetary boundaries and absolute reductions, which says that developed economies like Switzerland would have to reduce consumption levels by a factor of 8 in these 30 years to really achieve a sustainable level of use of natural resources, for example. So it's really a daunting challenge, and there's no time for incrementalism, but I'm going to argue that Switzerland, in fact, incrementalism is really the DNA of Switzerland in a way. And so it's an interesting case to think about, okay, how can you deal with these huge goals, and how can you be transformative if the policy system is actually favoring incremental change very much? So it's an interesting case to look into and start to think through these problems. Maybe also a critical remark about the SDGs at the beginning. I think they are really sort of, it's a great achievement that we have them as sort of a guiding vision, but at the same time, they also have some shortcomings. I mean, they emerged from a complex sort of negotiation process at an international level. So they have incoherencies, contradictions between them. And, you know, sometimes they actually split up problems into sectoral silos, and some of them, in some sectors, you need to combine different SDGs if you want to understand what you really have to do. So I think they're not something you can use one-on-one, you know, for defining sort of regional strategies, national policy strategies, but you need to somehow cut the cake in a good way, and then create sort of coherent visions that you want to achieve that are sort of going across these SDGs. Yeah, there's also the problem with the sort of, you know, the spatial complexity. So some of the SDGs, like sustainable cities and communities, certainly are sort of at a regional level problem to a large degree. Others, like having quality education, is rather solved at the national level often. And I'm going to argue that, you know, transforming the water sector will actually be a pretty global challenge. And then, you know, there's also these issues that often you have to think about combinations of different SDGs that are then sort of implemented, you know, at different levels. Or you could think about energy, renewable energy, you know, the energy transition, which is sort of a multi-scalar thing where you have to be active at the global, national, and subnational sort of levels, you know, in parallel. So how to sort of deal with this? I'm going to make hope that I can give some inspiration what transition studies is sort of adding here. And then we have to discuss, you know, further what to make with all of these ideas. Okay, so first of all, transition studies, the basic take on this problem is that it's about structural change in complex systems that fulfill societal function. So how is energy, transport, food, water provided? And the key concept in many ways in this field is socio-technical regimes, which is the combinations of technologies, certain institutions, values, regulations, and then actors and actor networks that co-evolve over time and stabilize into a very sort of path-dependent, coherent pattern that's really hard to change. So you can think about fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, mass tourism. These are all sort of guiding rationalities in these systems that are sort of dominant and really hard to fundamentally transform and change. And the transition then by definition will be a structural change in these unsustainable socio-technical regimes. And this can be triggered by different elements. So it could be that there's an exogenous shock, like the Fukushima accident, for example, that then triggers certain reconfiguration in the regime. It can be, and that has been the focus of transition studies for a long time, that, you know, new configurations emerge in a niche. So there's a certain context where a new combination of technologies and values and, you know, actors sort of get combined, and that then create a sort of very different way in which we can provide food or energy or whatever. And then increasingly now we also look into regime internal dynamics. So how do these regimes actually have their own contradictions, incoherencies that also open sort of, you know, cracks and opportunities for change. So the nice thing is it's a sort of a sectoral plus perspective on path dependency and change. So we don't only look at single sectors, but often it's sort of, when you think about transport, it's different sectors that get combined into the system that then provides transport, for example, which I think is quite nice. And there's of course also some weaknesses. For example, you know, we haven't dealt with the spatial sort of problems in these transition studies to a large degree yet. I come back to that later. So you all might know this figure. This is like has long been the sort of poster child of transition studies. So like this framework, the multi-level perspective, where exactly at the core, you know, you have this socio-technical stable regime, like I don't know, fossil fuel-based energy. And then you have these exogenous shocks and developments from a landscape like the Fukushima disaster, which might open a crack in the regime. And then you have these alternative configurations, new niche technologies, renewable energies that get scaled up and sort of aggregated and then start to really challenge this old way of doing things and establish a new way of doing things in the sector. And this has been criticized on many levels over time. First of all, this niche upscaling process, it's really not well specified what is happening there, how that works. how do regimes get destabilized and transformed? There's a lot of open question there. And then especially the spatial dynamics in this model, what role do regions play, countries, multiscalar networks, and so on. And another problem is also that we see in many sectors that we have actually maturing alternatives. So we see in renewable energies by now are so mature that the issue is not anymore to create more niches and more experimentation with renewables, but it's really about how can they now transform this regime, which is still resisting and actually pushing back on a lot of nice ideas on how to include renewables in the energy system. So a new way of thinking, and we are working on this now quite intensively at EAWAG, is to think more in a sort of configurational way, where you have sort of a dominant regime in a sector, which is here a combination of institutions, technologies, actors that have stabilized in a very coherent pattern. And then you have these niches, which is an alternative configuration, which is sort of established at the fringes of the system. And there's certain projects that help to create sort of a coherent combination. And then over time, this gets connected to the existing regime and is then able to somehow transform it and establish a new rationality, a new guiding logic of how the sector is working over time. And so there is actor networks behind this. There's policies and certainly also initiatives, local initiatives can play a role in this institutionalization process of the alternative, and then also the deinstitutionalization of the existing regime. And this also opens a new space, new methods, especially network methods that you can use to sort of trace these processes, which I think is really promising. So overall, we see in transition studies a move away from niche fetishism to more sort of configurational perspectives. And this process of institutionalization, deinstitutionalization is really at the core of interest. And so shifting the perspective there also means that we shift from just looking into technological innovation to also looking into institutional change. So how can you solve these big challenges, not only through technological innovation and growth, but also through social innovation, institutional adaptations, evaluation, and so on. It's also moved from bottom-up emergence to mission orientation and directionality. So we have now realized that just fostering niches and experimentation alone does not guarantee transformative outcomes. So you also have to combine this bottom-up experimentation with some top-down visions. And then there's a lot of talk now about mission-oriented or transformative policy mixes and so on. And then finally, we have also moved from regional containers to looking into the multi-scalar and multi-locational networks because regional actors, they seldom work in isolation, but more often they're embedded in sort of supra-regional, supranational structures and also in innovation dynamics. So, and the key argument then is that, the scope and the relevance of regional agency very likely sort of differs between the sector you want to transform. So let me illustrate this with some recent work we've been doing where we try to compare what's happening, how transition in water looks like versus how transition in the urban mobility sector would look like. And what we see in the water sector is basically a very coherent, sort of globalized regime. So there's one dominant paradigm on how you solve water and sanitation problems, which is large-scale centralized infrastructures, which we also have in Switzerland. And this is very deeply institutionalized in many parts around the world. It's taken for granted that this is the way to sort of solve sanitation issues. And this idea is diffused globally through transnational corporations, big investment banks, some NGOs that are active and basically reproducing this sort of solution all over the planet. So if you want to transform this sector, we have pretty limited agency at the regional level. So there is, of course, experimentation going on in different parts of the world, but they don't really sort of scale up, to such a global level that they really influence the global sort of regime logic in this sector. So we realize that if you want to transform this sort of thing, you really have to also be active at international levels, establish new technology standards for alternative configurations, change the investment logic of these large investment banks, influence the strategies of transnational corporations, and then regional experimentation, has a small role to play in these processes. Let's put it like that. Then on the other hand, you can think about mobility and transport, but there we have a very different situation because we have much lower coherence in the sort of, there's no coherent regime globally on how you solve the transportation sort of problems of cities. So usually on the one hand side, we see that there's different combinations of different solutions that get combined. So we have cars and buses and trams and bicycles that then together make for the transport solution of the city. So there's conflict between these different solutions all the time. And there's a lot of scope for adapting and changing, you know, the overall configuration. At the same time, so there's also more weakly institutionalized because the solutions are in conflict with each other, and there's like sort of constant battles between how you sort of create a nice model mix for a city. And it's also, there's much more spatial variation. So we see the transport system in Venice looks very different from the one in La Paz or in New York City, for example. And so also there's the spatial variation, which gives you a lot of templates you can draw on when you want to redefine, transform your own city's transportation system. So on the other side of the same coin, the same is true for innovation processes. So in some industries, like wind power, which is sort of a very famous green sector, we saw that at especially the early development phases, the innovation was happening in a very sort of condensed region in northern Denmark, which for many years was sort of the main place where knowledge was created, where the first sort of niche markets were popping up, where investment was raised for this idea, and also legitimacy for wind power created in a way. And so, you know, northern Denmark was really a lead sort of region in this field, and still until today, we see that they still profit from being such a first mover, because this is also a very spatially sticky industry that's based very much on doing, using, interacting types of learning and sort of customized valuation dynamics, which make it rather sticky in space. So you can have a first mover advantage and profit from that for a long time as a region. And on the other extreme, when you think about solar panels, then we see a very different story, because this is a very different industry, which is based on sort of STI-based innovation, standardized valuation, global mass markets, basically. We actually see a global network of different sort of regions in different parts of the world that together make up for the sort of innovation and manufacturing sort of system in this field. So we see that some, you know, knowledge comes from Europe and US regions, from Japan. The key markets are in Europe and Asia now. Manufacturing is happening mostly in China. And so, you know, here it's really hard for a region to retain a first mover advantage, because the industry is pretty fluid in space. It's reconfiguring every time when a new technological sort of approach comes up. This whole global structure is shifting. So it's much harder for a region to retain a solid first mover advantage. So then maybe another key question is, so what's the role then for regions in these transitions? And I would argue that there's many different roles you can take, and that you also have to be strategic about which role you take then in which sector. So one thing which we've seen with the example of wind power is that you can be sort of a trailblazer. So you can really be the place where a new configuration is being developed, and then sort of spreads out, is being exported from there to the rest of the world. So as I said, then you'll have a sort of a strong first mover advantage type of business model as a region. Second option would be that you're more of an anchor. So you have a specialized cluster of firms, or maybe a specialized lead market in your region, which you know, creates a lot of learning by doing, using, interacting. So you have a classic, in a way, agglomeration advantage, like now the provinces in eastern China that produce the solar panels for the rest of the world. Then you can be more of an experimentation or lighthouse site, where you are creating a new social technical configuration that's really cutting edge and highly interesting. A sort of flagship project that then really stands for a very new solution. And then you have sort of a prestige advantage, because everybody will refer back to your region when they want to also transform their sector, and they will come visit your region and say, okay, we want to do a similar project like, you know, they did in, I don't know, in Zurich in the renewable energy sector, for example. And then finally, you can also be more a side of decoupling. So that's being emphasized a lot also by grassroots sort of innovation scholars, which say a region can also consciously sort of decouple from the mainstream and develop a totally new sort of configuration that's then more focused on internal circulations, sort of on internal economic processes, and not so much, you know, about export success or competitiveness or prestige, but it's really about doing something that's set apart from the mainstream, and by this also becoming sort of transformative, especially if the same model is then replicated in other parts of the world. So maybe in Switzerland we have some biosphere reserves in Entlebuch, which is maybe a nice example where a whole region said, okay, we don't want to do sort of mass tourism, but we go consciously for slow tourism, and sort of frame a whole story around this idea in the region, and we sort of consciously decouple from the mainstream and then still profit from that, because you get a sort of a purpose advantage. So people that care about sustainable development, that have sort of sufficient lifestyles, they will go to this region and enjoy, the sort of solution that's presented to them there. So I have to switch this thing here. So the issue here is also that, here you're in a sort of clear, conventional innovation, export-based sort of framework. And down here, it's much more about valuation, creating new storylines for your region. And of course, I'd say the business model is very clear up here, and it gets more and more fuzzy and hard to define the more you go to this lower end of this figure. Could be interesting to discuss this later on. Okay, so now let's move on to Switzerland. And I would say Switzerland is interesting because we really have a transformation dilemma here. Because on the one hand side, we're this consensus-driven basic democracy. We have a long tradition in federalism and a lot of diversity in a very small area. We have 4 languages, urban and rural regions. We have strong regional industrial specializations in some regions and sectors. But then at the same time, we also have a liberal approach to innovation and regional policies and very export-oriented philosophy also in our regional policies. So the dilemma is that on the one hand side, we're this, as Daniel said, we're this great place for experimentation, bottom-up emergence, because there's all this diversity and all these different regions, and there's so much scope to recombine, knowledge from different fields. And also with the liberal approach, there's a lot of freedom to try out new things. But at the same time, with the sort of federal structure we have and this liberal approach, we also don't really have a lot of scope for defining supra-regional sort of strategies or create strong directionality, create big visions that then the actors can follow, in different regions. This is always eaten up a little bit in the federal process and in the democracy. So our grand national strategies, they really suffer, you see the special interests in them, and also the different interests from different regions are somehow reflected. So we can't really come up with a sort of coherent, unifying strategy of how we want to go about transitions in different sectors. So to illustrate this, basically we have a new regional policy, which we have discussed a lot in this event here, which is a patchwork of about 2,000 different projects that were funded since 2010 in a variety of sectors that try to induce sustainable development, but strongly also with a sort of economic rationale in the background. And then we have many other similar programs. For example, the Federal Office of Energy has more than 100 pilot and demonstration projects for renewable energy technologies. And then we have many more sectoral policies that also give similar incentives. So it's really like this complex mix or a melange of sustainability initiatives that lack, sort of a clear, sort of more coherent sort of guidance or a vision which are really contributing to. So some regions are able to bundle those. So I've heard some presentations yesterday where people, or let's say some regions, have really been successful in bundling some of these initiatives and using them, for example, to transform the economy into a new field. So that's certainly possible, but there's also many other regions that even struggle with getting funded in the first place. So there's no clear sort of, coherent guidance on how you can combine these things. And also, our regional development policies, they're stuck a little bit in a transition 1.0 framing. So it's still very much focused on, techno-economic prosperity, export industries, and so on. And it's very much emphasizing this bottom-up emergence and experimentation and making context-specific solutions happen. But as I said, we don't have this full systems view. And this also means we can't really question locked-in social technical regimes in many sectors, but we end up with projects that are sort of interesting and look sustainable, but still don't really question the status quo. At least there's no sort of visions, on how you could overcome some of these very powerful global regimes. Yes, and we also have limited scope for then developing cross-sectoral and cross-regional policies. As we depart from a rather sort of containerized view on regions in space. So what to do? So one thing which I think is pretty crucial that comes out of transition studies is that you will need some sort to combine this nice bottom-up emergence, experimentation, with some directionality from supra-regional levels. And as I said at the beginning, the SDGs alone cannot do the trick. So we need something more, some sort of really, let's say, engaging visions, which you could frame for different largely defined sectors, like in transport or food, for example, and which would have to be defined at some level. So, but who would do that in our system? That's really the tricky part. So the federal government lacks legitimacy in a way with our federal system. Academia and NGOs are trying to do that, and also regiosuisse was organized this event, is also trying to do this. But it's also then questionable, should academia be active? But then that's maybe too managerial. So it's really, so how could you define such a vision, a sort of mobilizing vision in the Swiss system? That's really a big challenge. Then secondly, I think we should reflect on the sectoral characteristics of, the sort of sectors we really want to transform, and then think about, okay, what's the role that regions can take in these different sectors, and where does it make sense to aim for being a global export leader? Where is it okay to just basically decouple? And so the examples of, you support solar power manufacturing in Switzerland, that wouldn't make much sense to do that with the regional strategy, because everything would flow out, into other parts of the world. But if you support slow tourism, of course, in some regions, then this is a very sticky thing, which is, very likely to stay and create an advantage in a long-term perspective. Yeah, and then there's a big question. So where does a regional focus then make sense? Where not with these local initiatives? So a very sort of initial hypothesis would be that we could sort of systematically move through different sectors, start to characterize how is their regime looking like, at which levels are important decisions being made, and then what can regions contribute. And if you have like sticky innovation patterns and weak global regimes, like in construction, transport, tourism, then it of course makes a lot of sense to develop these regional initiatives. And really, if you solve a regional problem in a nice way, that really is transformative in itself. And there's other cases like the water sector, where you have this strong global regime. So then solving a local water problem is of course useful, but how could it be becoming then more transformative? And then you probably have to also combine your regional initiative with national, international sort of activities to become really influential. Okay, so I'm leaving you with a few sort of discussion points, maybe, rather than a conclusion. So what's the challenge now for an imagined sustainability transition policy in Switzerland? So first of all, we would have to find ways to be non-incremental. And I think transition studies with this idea of regimes helps to sort of think through this a little bit. So when you define a project, what sort of sector are you sort of dealing with? What's the regime? What's the dominant rationality in this sector? And how does your project now question this, or maybe contribute to a new guiding rationality? So this would be a big challenge then, how to do that. Then, being and thinking in a multi-scalar, multi-locational setup. So what's really your contribution in the bigger scheme of things as a region? Does it even make sense to create a regional initiative in your sector or not? Then there's the challenge of being cross-sectoral. So how would you then sort of come up with sort of nexus thinking, system of system solutions that cross different sectors and SDGs? And then, how to be mission-oriented, or at least challenge-oriented. So how to define sort of a guiding vision that also the actors then in regional sort of context can refer to and define their own role in relation to this larger long-term goal. Yes, so that's all my open questions at the end. And yeah, thanks a lot for your attention. I really look forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Very good. So I would like to thank Christian Binz very much for this enlightening and very packed, stuffed presentation. So we got a lot of information to this very interesting topic. And I have to admit that all questions that we thought of in advance are almost all like a little bit framed and answered. But nevertheless, I think there are a lot of questions in the audience. And I also think that, we still have some leading key questions for the discussion. So in the present regime, we can see that radical innovations, for example, in the Silicon Valley and, for example, in the life sciences, combined with the ICT sector in many leading regions of the world, really lead and push the economy towards leading regimes. Yeah, the life science combined with the ICT sector, for example, is really a powerful sector, for example, and all the data sciences, big data in Silicon Valley, grabbing our data and so on, they're really pushing the paradigm towards this sector. So really big transformation. We can discuss if the sectors are sustainable or not, maybe not in our understanding of sustainability. And now in contrast to these big movements and big sectoral impacts that are really driving the world economy, also in the future when we look at leading studies. Our first question would be, what role do regional and local initiatives really play in this sustainability transition? Is it just like a drop, or is it really making a difference, and how can it make a difference? And I would encourage you, Christian, to give us a short statement on what you think. How can, this contrast between these local initiatives, that regional and these big global regimes that drive the economy, how can we handle this or approach this?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tina. That's a pretty challenging question, of course. So basically, I think it really depends on what sector you're looking at. And it could well be that in some cases, having a really well thought through regional initiative really has transformative effects. So also if you think about Silicon Valley now with this example, of course, if Silicon Valley fundamentally transforms its sort of guiding logic from, I don't know, economic competitiveness to sufficiency, it would have huge ripple effects throughout the world. So in that sense, in some cases, there's certain regions that really play a decisive role in sort of defining also alternative pathways. But, on average, I would say what's really crucial is that you come up with a way of how these different initiatives are somehow combined in a cohesive way over time, that they can help with the institutionalization, construction of something that works, a new configuration that works, and then over time transform an existing regime. So maybe even in the IT example, what we will see is over time that China develops a new way of managing big firms in the IT sectors. Europe has another sort of way. There might be some regions that create really innovative, platforms that have a different logic than what Silicon Valley is doing. And that is somehow these dots get connected over time, over the planet, and then really transform the system. But ultimately, I think my response is really that, it just depends on the sector you're looking at, what regions can do. And in some cases, they might be totally irrelevant. We also have to admit that. And in others, you can come up with really sort of smart strategies of pushing for transformative change through combining, what's already happening in the ecosystem in a nice way.
Okay, thanks for this answer. And I would at this point really encourage also the community here in this session to write your questions in the chat. So it's open and we can see it, so we can collect your questions over time and bundle them so we can have a nice discussion. Okay, thanks for your answer, Christian. And I think now we're coming to the next question. So you said that Europe and the United States and everybody's handled it in different way. And I mean, then at this point, public governments come into place. So how can they stimulate, how can they impact or push local and regional initiatives to a higher impact, maybe in contrast to these global regimes that are at stake?
So maybe I think that's again the point I made before about a sort of coherent vision or some sort of directionality that has to come from, I would say, supra-regional levels. So if you define, so if you take the energy transition in Germany as an example, basically what happened in Germany was that in the 90s and early 2000s, a sort of a bold vision was created at the national level. Okay, we will do an energy transition. We don't know how, it will be complicated and expensive, we know that for sure, but we will do this. And that's now the vision that will guide us through the next 10 years in a way. And what happened then is, that the actors reorganize around this. So a lot of initiatives pop up that now want to make this vision happen. Of course, there's up and downs and it costs more or less depending on where you are. And there's a lot of issues, but you have a sort of an endpoint which you can use in the experimentation of these sort of different local regional initiatives that also played a key role in making the energy transition in Germany happen. And I think that's in a way the model I would have in mind, that you know, the governments create these visions. Maybe mission-oriented innovation policies could help somehow, though that's also a complicated and kind of contested concept. So the government's thinking about cross-sectoral policy mixes, for example, that would help to push the system and just make the sort of boundary conditions in a way that we move away from locked-in incumbent regimes into new sort of guiding rationalities. That's where I see sort of the key role in a way of the sort of supra-regional policymaker.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, then you must come in from. So we have a question from the audience.
So I have a question complementary to this. Don't you think that actually in Switzerland, we have also democratic initiatives, and we can also push initiative from the bottom to change the law? It is difficult to change it, but it's an opportunity. And could we compare regional initiatives with experimentation or whatever to possible democratic initiative to change the law? And it would be the other way around as the second question. How could a region change the law from the bottom as an experimentation space for new institutions? That's my, because we always speak about downscaling institution to set up at the local level institution to promote innovation, but how local innovation could change upper scale institution. That's an open question for me. Have you a cue?
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. And indeed, that's a specialty of Switzerland in a way that this happens every now and then, that we can sort of change the guiding vision through sort of popular initiatives. Still, you know, on average, if you look at, you know, the policy system of Switzerland, I think we often end up in a more sort of incrementalist stage. So also if you create a sort of popular initiative, if you have a very bold vision, you're pretty likely to fail. So in a way, what you propose at the national level will have to be already sort of in sync with guiding rationalities, with sort of, you know, different, you know, parties and political movements that would support your ideas. So you can't be too bold in the visions you sort of put on stage through the system. So every now and then it works, but yeah, it's rather the exception than the rule that you can be sort of visionary in this process. But the other thing that's interesting, this sort of regional experimentation, because we're so small and so diverse, that actually happens quite often. And I also know examples from the water sector where some people in the city just decided we will treat our water and wastewater on site in our building. That's totally against all regulation, but they just visited the cantonal government and they said, yeah, okay, you can do this based on a sort of exceptional regulation. And that's possible in such a small sort of densely knit sort of networked system like Switzerland. And so that, I also think if then it works in one context and you maybe replicate another one, then that can really change also the laws in a sort of a very sustainable sort of manner.
Okay, so thanks for this answer and questions. And I see the discussion is running. So we have a question here from Dimitri, who also addresses the global and especially the national and the regional local level. So from which side the push comes in order to change or drive the change of the system. So maybe we read it. So the sustainability challenge is a global one, and Switzerland is no exception as a part of the problem. So directionality is not at regional level, but rather at the federal one. Addressing this challenge in a new type of growth context will be also a challenging issue for Swiss regions, for which they have to develop particular strategies adapted to their profile. How do you see the question of devising smart local strategies in addressing global issues? You want to answer this question quickly?
Thanks a lot for this question. I think I may be repeating myself a little bit, but you know, directionality comes from very different levels in different sectors. So as I said, in water, we have this strong global directionality. In others, like maybe tourism, you know, you can really be local. There's such a diversity of sort of approaches you can take to tourism, for example, where it's really hard to say. So in a way, we have to understand also better different sectors and where exactly the key leverage points for transformative change lie, at which scales do they really sit. So I think this can be really different, but I agree that the challenge is there for Switzerland. I also think that Swiss regions will probably have to experiment with totally new roles in this sort of global, sort of networked dynamics. What's the stance they take really? What is their strategy? So it can't be export success in all of these fields. So thinking about maybe smart ways of decoupling from the growth paradigm and creating a local economy that's somehow more independent could be something. But yeah, I think we first have to also understand better, okay, where does the path dependency really stem from in different sectors, and have sort of smart strategies to reply then also at the regional and other levels to that diversity in a way. There's a question coming up from the room here.
Okay, we're talking about regions. So we have the local scale, but when we talk about regions, and we look at regions in a European context, then we have NUTS 1 to 3. NUTS 1 is the country, Switzerland as a whole. NUTS 3 is the cantons, the 26 cantons. But in regional policy in Switzerland, we talk about micro-regions or municipalities, as we discussed today. So I think we need to be aware of this, where governments should intervene, or where local initiatives could be grounded. I think in the local initiatives could come from municipalities or micro-regions, much more than on the cantonal level. And I've been accusing administrations this morning with a side remark. I could tell more about what's going on in the canton of Grisons in this regard with the Green Deal, but just how do you see this? And what else is the region, if you talk about regions, maybe to both of you?
Yeah, thanks for that. I was now thinking about, cantons, which are sort of administrative regions in Switzerland when, talking through these issues. But it's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of agency in Switzerland also at this sort of sub-regional local level. That's true. And exactly like the cantons, it also depends. The size really varies between them. Their scope for their agency varies quite dramatically. And I would also argue that probably in some cases it would make sense to have sort of maybe a NUTS 2 level where you have coherent strategies between a few cantons in a way that then work on the same issue, like tourism in mountains. Yeah, exactly. So that also exists, I think, in the framing of regiosuisse, for example. But yeah, could be a big point of discussion, maybe how to also reframe this and maybe devise agency to other levels. I also think that if you have too much agency at the local level, like really like single municipalities, that helps to create very context-specific solutions. But there's a big danger, of course, that you then end up in incrementalism and reproducing all systems without really wanting to do that, but just because the local actors just work with what they have and they don't have too much scope to develop grand visions or think about how to deeply transform what's happening in one municipality. If it's like not a big city, of course.
Okay, I just was thinking when listening to your discussion about the different levels that also the sectoral regimes you talked about, there are sticky regimes like the wind power energy you made, and also the more global patterns, footloose, like the water sector, if I know, like, but the sticky was the wind power,
yeah, and footloose like solar power.
Solar power, exactly. Okay, so a question that I would have is, couldn't it be that, for example, the wind power industry transforms over time due to regulatory changes from a more sticky industry or sector to a more footloose? And when you see the dynamics of the sector, so that you say, okay, this is a global pattern, this is a more, I just, make it more simple. This is a more regional topic or sector, a more sticky sector. But when you take the dynamics of the sectors into account so that they can move from a more sticky to a more footloose or to a more global issue or the other way around, wouldn't it then make sense to anchor those patterns from regarding the policy levels from at each level, like at the federal level, at the cantonal level, at the municipality level, and from this, anchorage, you can also have local and regional initiatives in every level. So couldn't it be more do we have to make this distinction between these more global sectors and more, you know, regional sectors when it comes to the anchorage of the policies on the different levels? I don't know if you.
Yes, thanks for that. So I would argue that, you know, with the sticky, it's important. So if you anchor something, you really have to think about what is the sticky parts that we can anchor in a region. And in the case of wind power, this was both in a way the innovation part, at least in the early days of the industry. So you could really have a region that does the manufacturing and then also the sort of the market diffusion, learning by doing, using, interacting. It was all in one region, and created a lot of sort of, you know, positive externalities. Then also when the industry later sort of actually diverted into another development logic, this region was still central, and it was still the most innovative sort of knowledge space in the wind power industry in a way. So it retained that even when wind turbines became mass produced, almost mass produced in the end. But then, so the anchoring was, at the regional level in one or two regions of Denmark in a way, and they needed this sort of clustering. So you couldn't combine or make a sort of a multi-scale strategy out of this, because the issue is really the anchoring is happening in this regional environment in a way with this specialized knowledge sort of community. But maybe in other cases, you could really think about strategies where you combine interventions at different levels that then make sense to maybe support this anchoring in the long run. So I don't have a good example, but it makes sense, I would say, you're suggesting.
So another question from the local audience.
Yeah, maybe it's something between a question and a comment, or just an idea. I have the feeling that maybe we're mixing a bit two things in the discussion, which are both relevant for regional policy, but which are different. One is kind of the innovation in a region and the technological change that comes out of that region. And the other one is the adoption of certain technologies to a region. And I guess the dynamics are very different. You gave the example of tourism. I have like a background in tourism before, and I think tourism is a good example where it's a lot about adoption of things that are existing in different places around the world, and they put together in a regional context, and that makes the case unique. And that's kind of what we're searching for. And then you have other, maybe more manufacturing or more technology intense things that you also mentioned, where it's more about having this kind of specific configuration of actors that is unique globally, and that leads to the strength of the region. And I guess both aspects are important, but I guess if thinking about the regime and how to transition towards sustainability, they're like two different aspects of the story. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yes, I think this is an excellent observation. I really agree with that. And you can also, tourism is maybe a great example. So there you can then anchor, a storyline in a region, but it's not about technological innovation or whatever, but it's really about the storyline you create for what your region stands for, that then makes it sticky and a success model over long periods of time. And then, so I think you could maybe come up with a typology. So we've tried to do that on the innovation side to say, okay, in some industries, you anchor important stuff on the sort of demand side and valuation sort of systems. In others, you anchor the important things at the production sort of side. And then you can also do both at the same time or nothing really in the region. You just connect to global pipelines. And that also still works for creating a local path. So thinking through these differences in a sort of typology or structured way, I think is really interesting and promising.
I have another question. Do you think a transformation policy is still an innovation policy? Because we are also in regional studies or stuck in this concept of innovation, and we know how to promote innovation, but are we still in a broader innovation policy perspective, or are we in another type of policy when we speak about upscaling and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think we're still trapped a little bit in innovation thinking, but it should, of course, be, yeah, another thing. Yes, like a broader notion of development policies. I don't know, sort of cross-sectoral, and it's not just, you know, innovation in the sense of techno-economic sort of progress, but really combining, yeah, with valuation aspects.
Replication is also
yeah.
a big issue.
Replication is also an issue. Yeah. And yeah, also this whole issue about being cross-sectoral, it's still not resolved really anywhere in a nice way. I think so. It really is a new, yeah, type of thinking there.
Is there some direction to think about what could be a transformative policy? Everybody speaks about transformative policy, but actually, what is it?
Yes, I mean, there are recent debates about transformative innovation policies, about mission-oriented policies, policy mixes. Not an expert in this field really, and I think it's still very much emerging. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly visions on how to do that, how to define that. But then, yeah, how would you translate? I think there's a lot of open space there to improve the thinking.
I think also the regional policies have this transformatory aspect in them. So not explicitly, but they transport it and foster regional transformation. Okay. So I would like to encourage you in the wider audience there, you can really write us in the chat if you have further questions. So we will read them and discuss about them. And here I will move on to the third key question for this discussion. So we could see that maybe some of the SDGs are more relevant for regions and regional and local initiatives than others. When you contrast it in what we just heard to the sectoral regimes and on which level they play. So maybe we can think of some SDGs that are really very suitable and make a big difference and impact at the regional and local level, and maybe others not. And then we can also reflect on why. So why is this difference? But first of all, we can think altogether for which SDGs regions and regional initiatives play a key role. Do you want to begin, Christian, in this reflection?
So this is really at the edge of you know, my knowledge and expertise now. And generally, I would say it, you know, we could think about, for example, water, which is something I'm really working on, where, you know, just reflecting back on the point before by Romano, that, you know, you can now maybe think through this in two ways. So one is, if you want to transform how the sector works, you have to be sort of have global outreach and sort of change the TNC's sort of directionality. But this might still make sense to think about sort of implementation locally, you know, in your local environment on how to improve how you organize water sort of services. And so there's literally maybe two sides to the same coin. So you can think about, okay, doesn't make sense really to do sort of an innovation initiative in your region if you don't have a global vision in a way how you want to transform the sector with this. But it makes sense to somehow do a novel implementation, sort of a new context adapted solution that's really more sustainable than what happened before. And so then you can start thinking about maybe these two sides of the same coin in a more structured way. So that could make sense. Generally, I would say that, you know, I think the SDGs would have to be addressed in combinations, so that you define coherent combinations of them where you say, okay, there's like a bold sort of cross-sectoral vision, let's say achieving net zero cities, for example. That would be a combination of, you know, the urban SDG plus the energy SDG plus agriculture plus whatever, you know, that plays a role in this. And then you can think about this sort of this bundle of problems. And then you could have another one about creating sustainable food alternatives. And then it's again agriculture, water on land, below water. And then you can think about in sort of bundles that make sense. There have been some suggestions on this from Jeffrey Sachs and others that have come up with this sort of 6 generic SDG transformations that you could use in this more structured thinking, which I find quite interesting, instead of, you know, thinking through each of them in isolation, which often, yeah, doesn't make too much sense.
Just one last point. When we talk about SDGs and which SDGs should we try to achieve at what level, we should not talk about SDGs. We should go further down to the sub goals or targets, how they are called. And those have been grouped. 170 or 69 targets have been grouped to 17 SDGs. Now we have proposals to group the 17 again, so have a more hierarchical system of goals. And you mentioned, by the way, that they are not coherent. They need some revision, but they're a good political starting point to bring the global community towards sustainable development. But just a remark.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I also agree, this has to be cut in nice ways, and there's quite some way to go to really come up with a nice sort of cutting procedure.
Okay, so are there any more questions? We could read your comment, Dimitri. Thanks for this. It's very interesting. And if there are no more comments or questions, I would encourage you to, if you have questions, to write them in the chat now. From our local audience here, I think we don't have any more questions, do we? Comments? Okay. So if there are no more questions, I would really thank Christian for his very nice presentation and also for answering all of our questions. What was quite challenging, I think, but thanks a lot for this. And now I will give the word to Daniel again to close the session. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tina. Thank you a lot also, Christian, for this inspiring ideas that you presented. I think, yeah, we had new ideas. For the first time, I heard of the idea of a transformation policy, that there's maybe a new direction that policy making could take, which combines different sectors to different SDGs in different sectors, give them a direction, this directionalism, which we also can use then at different spatial levels. So this was really interesting, but it shows me personally also that it's a long way to go. So we're not at the point that we have to be, but we are in a good starting point. We had a good discussion. I see the direction for the directionalism, which is a good thing. What is the follow-up? So we had the discussion today. I thank everyone that participated. I thank particularly also Hugues for organizing the session together with RSA. We will go on here physically in Andermat in the Swiss Alps with a co-creation lab, a short workshop where we want to answer the questions: which stakeholder for which SDGs, which roles could regions have to go in the direction of a transformation policy. So this is an interesting point we take up, and we have a little discussion here physically. The colleagues in remote, in digital, I thank for the participation, and I wish you a nice evening, and many thanks for the participation. And goodbye from Switzerland, from the Swiss Alps. Have a good time. Many thanks to Liza, many thanks to Hugues. Have a good time. Goodbye to everybody.